Thank you both for those comments. Again, Dr. Bond was joined by her co-chair, Kanta Subbarao, director of the WHO Collaborating Center for Reference and Research on Influenza. And now we'll begin our Q&A session. Simply type your question into the chat box below the video frame to submit a question. And let me first introduce other committee members who have joined us to help answer questions. We have Maria Elena Bottazzi, Associate Dean of the National School of Tropical Medicine and Professor of Pediatrics at Baylor College of Medicine, co-director of the Texas Children's Center for Vaccine Development, and co-chair of the Vaccines and Therapeutics Task Force for the Lancet Commission on COVID-19. We also have Annette Fox, Senior Research Scientist in the Collaborating Center for Reference and Research on Influenza at the World Health Organization. We also have Grace M. Lee, Professor of Pediatrics at Stanford University School of Medicine, and Joshua M. Sharfstein, Professor of the Practice in Health Policy and Management at Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health. Thank you all for joining. So let's get us started with the first question is, with the wealth of data from COVID-19 immunization efforts, are there lessons for future outbreaks related to cost-benefit analyses of vaccinations at the country level?
I'm happy to take this one. First, I want to just thank our chairs for steering our committee through these really rich discussions. It's been really wonderful. I wanted to especially call out also Huda Sultani, who's been amazing to work with. In terms of individual country level cost benefit analyses, I think the rationale for it is twofold. One being that we need to continue to make the business case, as was mentioned in the prior session, for the importance of building the infrastructure that's needed for vaccine development and delivery of these vaccines. And the health and economic impact has been tremendous, but in many ways, it is really difficult for us to continue to invest in prevention as an important effort. I really appreciated also Phyllis Arthur's comment that in many ways we don't question the investment of preparedness when it comes to defense, but it is really hard for us to invest that same level of both capacity building as well as financial investment in health prevention. And so we hope that this will actually provide direct evidence of benefit to countries about the importance of this investment, recognizing that there are many priorities that countries face.
Thank you. Does anyone else want to add anything to that? All right. Next question. Would prioritizing some sectors or ages across countries have a greater impact than others?
Yeah, I think I could try to take that one. So I think that we know with seasonal influenza that there are certain age groups and sectors that are at greater risk of disease, and you can focus on them in your initial rollout of a vaccine. But with pandemics, I think we have to watch and see what the epidemiology is and be able to tailor the response. So, for example, with the 1918 pandemic, there was a W-shaped curve where, in addition to the two extremes of age, there was a lot of disease and mortality in the young, healthy adults. But that same curve did not apply in all the subsequent flu pandemics that we've had in the last 100 and few years. So I think that for instance, in the 2009 pandemic, people over 50 were largely spared because there was a virus that had circulated in the 1950s, that was somewhat similar, and there was some residual immunity that protected the elderly from severe disease. So I think we do have to wait and watch, even though we can create some guidelines based on prior experience and based on seasonal influenza, but we have to have the ability to pivot and to modify.
Thank you. Next question is, how close are regulators to accepting a standardized measure of cellular immune responses as correlates of protection?
Joshua, can you take that?
Sure. I would say not that close as far as I'm aware. I don't know, I would say all the details, but there are certain, correlates that are accepted, particularly for the response to the protein that is now the major antigen, but cellular immune responses, I don't think so. It's one of the things that we talk about in the report, that it's really important to develop new correlates of protection, perhaps even better than the ones that we have, and particularly as they relate to novel vaccine platforms. And being able to do that is the difference between having to do a huge study every time and being able to do a much more efficient study just focused on the correlates of protection in the case of a pandemic. So there's a lot at stake with being able to develop new correlates of protection, and we think it should be a big emphasis.
If I could just add a little bit to that, it's we've talked in our committee about the need to standardize assays, and there's a tremendous need to do that. And there are several consortia, including some public-private partnerships that have made a lot of inroads in standardizing assays, including some assays for cell-mediated immunity to influenza. So one example is the FluCup, which is a correlates of protection consortium in Europe.
I would also say that some assays are more amenable to standardization. I mean, the sort of flow cytometry-based assessments are very tricky. There's a huge variation in results between groups. I think, there's, for the basic sort of absolute counts of lymphocytes, that came a long way with HIV. Absolute counting platforms came up, and international standard or international quality assessment schemes have been put in place, so it's not impossible. But some other assays, such as ELISpot, I think FluCop and others have done quite a bit on working on that, and that probably has some prospects on the T cell side. On the B cell side, I think that's also really important that we get a handle on the memory B cells and how well they are induced by vaccine and maintained, because they can provide a rapid source of protection even when antibody levels are low. So I think there hasn't really been a lot of effort on that front, and that's something that we would really want to invest in a lot more.
Thank you. Next question is, manufacturing mRNA has more difficult cold chain requirements than egg-derived vaccines. What new bottlenecks would be created in the move to mRNA to control a pandemic? Clinical, it is a big hurdle. Ethical and statistical, to demonstrate incremental efficacy improvements compared to a partially effective flu vaccine. What can regulators do to reduce this hurdle?
Maybe I can start with the first part of the question and speak towards, the challenges to bring new technologies, as we've seen with manufacturing of mRNA for COVID-19. And I think the key here, as we highlight in the report, is to really involve the manufacturers very early on in the participation of learning and ramping up the know-how building the human capacity, the workforce that can understand, the nuances of bringing into the manufacturing scales how to produce the RNA technology, and therefore then, explore the opportunities of how can you not only scale them, do it in a certainly affordable manner with the right reagents and supplies, but at the same time, evaluating the ability of creating them in a way that it can be accessible within, for example, the cold chain requirements. So I think that, the bottlenecks are primarily related to, it will be a steep learning curve for the manufacturers, but if they participate early, as we recommended to in R&D activities, in data sharing activities, in how to adapt the technology and bring it in such that it makes sense within their capabilities and their structure, I think that will be something that will really advance the field. And then, of course, have the opportunity of transitioning them into appropriate clinical trial designs. Maybe I can transfer the second question to another committee member.
Just jump in very quickly and say that there are statistical designs like non-inferiority designs that allow you to do a comparison to an existing vaccine that can be done practically. So I think that sometimes that requires a few more patients, but it doesn't make trials impossible to do. One of the key points in our report is that we can do this during a regular flu season. So you can bring up a new technology and have a big trial during a regular flu season, work on establishing correlates of protection, really understand the efficacy of a new technology, and then be in a really good position for a pandemic. And just waiting for the pandemic and trying to do all this right then is going to be much harder than taking advantage of the fact that we have annual flu season.
And I wanted to just perhaps add one thing, which is, now with the COVID-19 vaccines, the mRNA vaccines, we are really fortunate that the pediatric formulation is more refrigerator stable out to 10 weeks, which I think, it took us a while to get here, but this is a very different situation, at least for our ability to deliver these vaccines compared to where we were in December 2020. With the ultra cold freezer temperature requirements. And so would just continue to encourage the innovation and development that needs to happen with the end goal in mind, which is really thinking about what are the delivery requirements in different countries and how can we maximize our ability to vaccinate large populations under different implementation conditions.
I think one of the other points of the need for having larger clinical trials and putting more investment into clinical trials was, even if we are trying to trial universal vaccines that may not reach the same high or same level of efficacy as a strain-specific vaccine, at least it will give us an indication of what efficacy they may have against a completely novel strain. And it will also give us an opportunity to develop correlates of protection for these types of vaccines that we currently lack. So, yes, we would need large studies with seasonal influenza as a clinical endpoint, but, that investment would give a lot of return in terms of pandemic preparedness.
Thank you. Our next question is, why does the report say a universal flu vaccine is the, quote, ultimate prize?
Kanta?
Sure, I'll take that one. So the reason we think that universal influenza vaccines would be the ultimate prize is that they, different people define universal influenza vaccine differently, but a truly universal influenza vaccine would obviate the need to update seasonal influenza vaccines annually and would provide protection against a novel influenza strain that emerges. So being able to vaccinate and get get good coverage and good protection from virtually any influenza virus would make it, would be a real game changer.
Presumably also it would make the cost of vaccine less burdensome, because you have one vaccine that can do it all and you don't have to each year gear up and try to get the next one. So you'd have a thing, the system in place to really go just crank it out.
Thank you. Our next question is, if it is accepted that vaccine pressure changes viral ecology, favoring increased prevalence of escape mutants, is there interest to fund as a research model study of influenza vaccine impacts on the viral ecology in large livestock populations? For example, how does influenza vaccination of swine populations impact the variability of circulating influenza variants?
So I can try to take that one and see if anybody else wants to jump in as well. So there are some studies that are conducted. So there's influenza surveillance in swine populations, and there's depending on which part of the world you live in, the swine herds livestock are vaccinated. Pigs are vaccinated, and in China, they are vaccinating poultry with a vaccine to protect and to prevent H5 and H7 influenza viruses. So in China, they were very, very successful in controlling H7 and H5 infections in poultry. So we haven't seen any H7N9 human infections for about 2 years now. And we've been seeing a little uptick of H5N6. So again, just like with human seasonal influenza, they may have to update their vaccines. But it's a good question. I think that it's not likely that vaccine pressure is driving all of the antigenic drift, because there's not enough vaccine used globally for the vaccine to be responsible. But vaccine-induced pressure could play a role, and so that it would be, a good system to study in animal populations as well.
Thank you. Our next question is, unprecedented data and cost sharing between manufacturers allowed for the scale up for COVID vaccines. Without the same urgency, do you ever see this being copied for seasonal vaccines? And how do we make that scalable?
I can try to take that question. I think we do highlight that indeed what we need is to keep the momentum and incentivize the manufacturers to be able to continue with the ability of participating and collaborating amongst themselves, especially during the normal business as usual times, right? During, even the years where we just have to advance innovation in the seasonal vaccine design. But I think that it will be important to indeed give them that incentives. And that's why in our recommendations, we call for the actions from organizations such as World Health Organization and, of course, the U.S. government agencies to provide a path towards bringing all these manufacturers together so that they can continue seeing the ability of collaborating and feeling the need to continue collaborating and sharing their challenges and, of course, looking for solutions that then can be very rapidly adapted in the event, of course, of a pandemic influenza situation. So it is clearly a group effort that it will require the agencies to really be the framework where they can call for the ability of meeting and sharing the information and bring the incentives for them to be able to participate.
Josh, you want to add to that? No, Hoda, maybe, or Kanta. Yeah, sorry.
Yeah, no, I don't really have anything to add. I think that's I think that is what we've called.
Yeah, I think the example, Kanta, that you told us at the committee about, we already have tried to develop other platforms, but without that sustained funding, they really haven't gone forward to fruition, or they don't compete well with the current egg-based vaccine.
Yeah, and I think the other example is really that when there have been efforts to diversify the manufacturing to countries that weren't previously manufacturing influenza vaccines, some companies have had difficulty in sustaining a market. And so that's one of the reasons why doing studies to define the burden of disease would help as well, to sort of keep those players alive.
I just reemphasize that the urgency of pandemic preparedness should be helpful here. I mean, as much as we can make the case for seasonal flu, the ability to do this is really important for pandemic preparedness, and that should hopefully drive more support, collaboration, and progress.
Thank you. Our next question, can you expand on the recommendation 5.2 on increasing transparency in clinical trials? What's the best way to do that?
Well, I'm happy to jump in. I think there are different dimensions of transparency, but one of them, you can see from the good work that the FDA did that there were clear standards for the clinical trials, that key data was shared about the clinical trials. There was an advisory committee that discussed that data publicly. This did not happen in every country, for example. So I think those things are very important. There are also some, basic details about clinical trials when they start, when they're halted, why they're halted, that are really kind of basic things that I think if a regulator is able to be transparent about, then it avoids the possibility of, misunderstanding, which can really undermine the confidence that people have in product development. So I think all across from the origins and the standards all the way through the results and the decision making, transparency I think is really important these days, because we know that even like a day of confusion can lead to 1,000 theories blooming on the internet that really can confuse people. I'll just also say that we ultimately support the idea of sharing of some of the key underlying data to the extent possible. That probably can't be done in real time, all of the data in real time, but key data in real time can be shared. And we saw that happen, I think, very successfully in this country.
Yeah, I might chime in that in addition to the importance of transparency and public confidence in both the process as well as the recommendations, I think in many ways it also enables efficiency by essentially creating these standards or articulating them and recognizing that they may change over time. But it allows not only manufacturers, but I think the public to better understand, how vaccines are being judged in terms of safety and efficacy. And I will emphasize again, Josh's point about having federal advisory committees. I do believe, for example, VRPAC deliberating on the regulatory sort of needs that they felt were important for vaccines in various populations, I think has been really helpful to have those discussions and open in public. And it allows us to be able to ensure that diverse perspectives are heard, and also that the public can watch those meetings and understand sort of how these decisions are made. So the rationale for these decisions, I think, is important, and transparency is a part of that public process.
Thank you. Next question. So this is in reference to one of the conclusions that says low and middle income countries have disease burden studies performed, vaccination rates are improved. So given that, what is the best way to incentivize burden of disease studies in low and middle income countries?
So I can take the first part and have my colleagues jump in after. So I think I was referring to this in part because we've had the experience in the past following the first recognition of avian influenza viruses circulating and the 2009 pandemic. So there was an effort that the WHO led to try to bring developing country manufacturers into this space and to develop homegrown influenza vaccines. And some of these companies have actually struggled to find a market because the local policymakers and actually the local population doesn't necessarily recognize the need for influenza vaccines. So the WHO is doing some of this, but we certainly need a lot of support to do burden of disease studies in lower and middle income countries so that people can recognize the importance of influenza. There are so many competing priorities in countries with a heavy disease burden caused by many other things. And so that we do need to incentivize this with funding. And so to make funding available and potentially work through the WHO, because they've already set up protocols and can actually talk through a design that would allow the burden of disease studies to be compared to other countries. So there are tools available. So I think the reality is that we need some funding support for it.
And maybe I'll just add that I think to reflect perhaps a broader definition of burden of disease, just recognizing that, for example, I'm a pediatrician, and in children, it's not just the health impact of the disease, but it's really, what is the educational impact, the impact on social emotional functioning, the financial burden it causes because of workforce capacity issues. So I think that we also need to not only think of it in its traditional sense of burden of disease, but we need to go beyond health to really understand the full impact of some of these infections that I think, at least for COVID-19, is clear it has had long-term consequences. But I also believe that those impacts translate into influenza.
Thank you. And I believe we'll move on to this will be our last question. On the last recommendation on code of conduct and press release, can you expand how the companies can do this and what guidelines they should adopt?
Sure. So I think that one of the concerns that a number of people had, including a number of public health officials, is that sometimes people were learning about key information from company press releases without a lot of information, and the regulators weren't talking about it at all. And that wasn't just about like the great news about a trial, but also about what was happening behind the scenes when the trial got stopped. And if that wasn't a press release, it might have even just been like a comment to investors. And so, when that happens, it undermines confidence in the regulators. It leads to a lot of confusion. I was on a different National Academy meeting where health officials were saying, a company would say something, we would get 100 questions and the regulator couldn't say anything, and we had no idea where to turn, and it just undermined our ability to know what was going on and to provide leadership in the middle of a pandemic. And so I think the idea is that there should be opportunities for companies to talk about their products, but it should be well coordinated with the regulator, and that every communication should really emphasize the role of regulatory review, so people don't hear a result and go like, why can't I get this today? It seems like I should get it today, and then I'll automatically be angry before there's even any chance of reviewing. And we've seen that when review happens, even in a pandemic, there are all kinds of things that get identified, and sometimes the result isn't exactly as it was originally put forward. So I think that the goal for this recommendation is to put this kind of thing on the radar screen. I don't think we presume to say here's exactly the code of conduct that companies should adopt, but the principle is that we should be communicating, and communication should really be geared towards the overall outcome of good information for the public in a way that doesn't create more confusion and undermine trust in public health and regulatory agencies. And we hope that this recommendation starts a conversation that can lead to a responsible code of conduct for industry.
Any other comments? All right, well, those are all the questions we have for today. Thank you to all of our committee members and for all of you who joined us this morning. Again, the 4 reports that are being discussed today are available for free download on the same page where you are viewing this video. And also a reminder that the next session, which will begin at 1 p.m. Eastern, will cover the studies on public health interventions and supply chain. So have a great rest of your morning, and we hope to see you back here at 1 p.m.